Okay, thank you. So I'm doing most of the presenting on behalf of Pinion Advisory and myself, and Tayla Blight from Pinion Advisory is also with us, and she'll be doing some of the presenting as well. This screen's a little bit slow, so just bear with me while we sort out the... Okay. So Wimmera Southern Development commissioned both ThinkAgri, which is my company, and Pinion Advisory to address a specific issue in relation to wind development opportunities. And that was really around helping people with the decision of whether to host or not to host wind developments. And so we chose to put that in economic terms, in terms of what is the opportunity cost. But with all things economic, it's just not purely monetary. So our approach was to survey 8 farmers to get a range of perspectives and experiences, to sort through that information and talk to wind energy companies themselves and other people within the energy industry to seek clarification of various issues. We developed some decision-making tools to help each unique farm situation assess their opportunities, and we conducted some financial analysis for some case studies. So many thanks to the people who helped us out there. I'll hand over to Tayla for now, and Tayla, you can go through the issues.
Well, thank you, Kate. So as part of sort of the surveys that we conducted, I spoke to a range of hosts, non-hosts, farmers that are pro wind farms, as well as more the anti-farmers. So the aim was we sort of wanted to understand all the different reasons and viewpoints, as well as the main concerns. So we sort of surveyed farmers both in the northern and southern region. Through this, we sort of worked out there were 4 sort of main concerns surrounding all the surveys and interviews, which are sort of around disruption, distrust, division, and the decommissioning. Next slide, please, Kate. So with the disruption, it was sort of around the operational efficiency loss, as well as sort of the visual appeals, the operational impacts, and the GPS lines. So now when I spoke to one of the farmers, one of the problems was around the placement of the AV lines. So I think something to really sort of consider is to make sure that that's written in any contract that you want to align with your AV lines as close as possible. The other main impact was sort of around the increased time for sowing. So sort of having to sow around the concrete bases of the towers particularly, as well as the visual appeals, which can be polarising if you're not so used to seeing the towers particularly. With the decommissioning, seemed to be a common concern with most of the farmers that was sort of approached. And so this was sort of around unclear, I guess, just unclear regulations around the decommissioning. So with that, when we sort of approached the wind farm companies, they did sort of mention that with the decommissioning that they put money into a trust fund, I think 5 years before the end of the life of the towers, just sort of act as a bit of a safety net for the money that will then be used for the decommissioning and that. But I think it's really important to make sure that you sort of approach a lawyer and get it checked over in the contract and make sure that's definitely included, particularly around like the removal of the concrete and what depth that removal occurs to, as each sort of contract is written and more personalised, just sort of make sure that the depth is included in that and get that sort of checked over by a legal professional. Also, like the long time frame of the project can sort of create a bit of uncertainty, with around 12 years from the project planning phase until the construction is complete is a common sort of time frame that we heard from the farmers. One of the other ones we sort of came across was the distrust. So working with a large corporate practice is something we're not commonly really used to working with, and particularly with the poor consultation that has occurred has sort of sparked this to be more of a concern. One of the other ones was the polarising of the towers. So we're sort of not used to seeing them. I think they can sort of stand out and be quite polarising, which has created like community unrest and caused many awkward situations. One of the things as well, it's important to communicate with the wind farm companies, as we did have a few farmers sort of mention that there was mess left behind and stuff like that from some of the workers on the wind towers, particularly during the construction phase. So I think it's just important that we sort of communicate any concerns or whatever, particularly around that as well. Next, please, Kate. However, with some of the cons that sort of come with the wind projects, there's many pros that come with it as well. Particularly when I sort of spoke to the farmers was mainly around the passive income stream. So from having the towers, just having a steady income coming in was one of the main reasons why they sort of chose to have the towers, which can be particularly important with climate change and frost impacts and droughts and stuff like that. Just sort of having that steady income made a significant difference to the farmers I spoke to. There was a few sort of things mentioned just sort of around property value and where we sort of saw both sides, where some farms are sort of saying that potentially there could be areas where property value could increase as a result, as there is that steady income stream already on the property. One of the main things that was sort of mentioned throughout most of the interviews was how it's been helping with succession. So I know I spoke to quite a few farmers who sort of said they've sort of used it to, I don't know, pay mum and dad out, or use it for like an off-farm sibling as well. And just sort of, that was one of the reasons why they sort of chose to have the towers. Another thing was the road quality. So quite often, just sort of around the towers and the projects, there's been better like all-weather roads, which can particularly be used for harvest and carting hay. So that can be another handy factor as well. And then a few sort of mentioned the community funding. So I think it was around 3,200 per megawatt is put aside for community funding. However, that was sort of really dependent upon the project. And that's something that's decided by the community as well, and what they want to put that money towards. So whether that's a sporting club or a new oval or a new playground, that sort of thing. So that can be quite handy for the community as well. Cool, thanks, Kate.
So just to conclude from Tayla's survey, that I guess the things comes back to what we can do as individuals, and some of the things that clearly came out of the experience of others was that the specifics of the construction process, the operations notification parameters, the alignment of towers, for example, all of those things are negotiable. And it may not appear like that when first approached by a company, but that's the reality. It's important to accurately estimate the tower footprint and the operational impact for your situation, and we'll see some examples of that, because often it's actually less than you think, and in some areas it might be more than you think. Again, we can do some work on estimating the income scenarios, and that's the bit that we're going to look at next, and really encourage people to talk to current hosts about their experiences. I guess I just wanted to also put this in a broader context. There's some recent survey work around the VicGrid's energy transition plan and where the renewable energy zones might be, and they did a series of really solid engagement, and they talked to regional community groups, including local government. They talked to traditional ownership groups, and they also spoke to industry. And what struck me was that the prominent themes when speaking to regional community groups was around agriculture and land use and the impact on the regions. You know, those two things together add up to 45.6%. And the dominant sentiment was the royal blue line there, which is negative. And if we take a look at the industry, the energy industry itself, when they looked at the report, you know, they were more interested in the technical side of the report, which is understandable because that's their industry, making sure that there's technical rigor in the report. There was less interest in the impact on the regions and the agricultural land use, and a more neutral sentiment than either negative or positive. And I guess what struck me there is that really this is a really complex project or complex issue, and what we're dealing with is an arranged mixed marriage of industries and a mixed marriage of ways we're doing business and some values misalignment. And if you're interested in that report, you might want to just grab a photo of that link. So what's the relevance to the work that we undertook? Well, we've got a lot of humans that are under stress, and there's no denying that. And humans under stress are very prone to decision-making bias. And the findings of neuroscience demonstrate that data can actually help those thinking processes. We also, Rob Brown's a farm planning expert from Pepin Planners, and he's also a qualified psychologist. And he states that emotions actually predetermine how we receive data and then how we make sense of that data. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before we go into the data itself. So because every farm's different and every community's different, we wanted to create some tools that you could use or could be used by professionals who are helping farmers make these decisions. And one of the tools we created was a spreadsheet where you can put in the parameters around the kilometres of permanent track to be on the farm, how wide those tracks are going to be, the kilometres of construction tracks, the size of the turbine hard stand, and then it gives you a total footprint. So for one example, from Westwind, the total footprint is about 1.1 hectare per turbine. So if you've got a farm where there's going to be 15 tonnes, the total footprint is going to be, 15 towers, not tonnes. The total footprint is going to be 16.5 hectares for that particular farm, which turns out to be about 1.1%. And that lines up with the people Tayla spoke to, as in the current host. Most of them talked about using an area of 1 to 2% of land area when estimating how much land's being taken out of production. It's obviously that's going to change depending on the size of the farm and the number of towers. I guess it also seems it was surprisingly low to some people, and that was brought up at the seminar we had at Longanon. And even if you ground truth it with Google Earth, you tend to come up with a similar number. So I just developed a rule of thumb. If you want to be on the really conservative side, if you multiply the tower number by 1.3 to 1.5, so that's construction footprint, not percentage, that will give you an idea of how many hectares are going to be taken out of your farming system. And if you contact us, we can send you these spreadsheets to put your own numbers in. The other series of lookup tables we did was just so that you could work through scenarios yourself. So one of the major variables is the amount of megawatts coming off the tower and then the dollars per megawatt. So in the examples that we were looking at with the newer towers of say 6 to 7 and $6,000 per megawatt, you've got an income there of $36,000 per tower. But clearly there's, a big range from depending on those two variables. Say, a 4 megawatt tower and $4,800 is only 19,000, so significantly less. So it's really important to have these details. And if you're comparing with other folks, it's important to make sure that you've both got the same, you're singing off the same hymn sheet in terms of the technical details. So then we could say, well, okay, we've got around 36,000, so we're using 35 in this example. And on a farm where there's going to be 8 towers, that's a passive income of $280,000. And again, most of the farms we spoke to were in the vicinity of sort of 2 to 6 towers, yet we know there's some significant projects where individuals could be, hosting 20 towers or even more. So it's really important to do the calculations for your scenario. Then if we take that scenario of around 300,000 and look at, say, if you've got a whole farm EBIT. So EBIT is the earnings before interest and tax. So it includes your net income, so gross income minus costs. But it doesn't include, sorry, there's a little typo there, that doesn't include interest and tax, but it excludes depreciation. So in this case, at $1 million whole farm EBIT, that 300,000 represents 30%. So it gives you an additional 30%, I guess, of passive income. And again, depending on, the amount of passive income and the whole farm EBIT, each year, the influence of that passive income will change. So to demonstrate that with a little more detail, we did 2 financial analysis case studies. So basically one aimed in the north and one aimed in the south. And there was variables in there around farm size, around equity, and around tower size, with the 4 megawatt sort of representing the typical towers that were built, 5 years ago or so, and 7 megawatt representing the towers that are on offer to be built in the next few years. So we just use 5 towers in this situation to represent, it was typical of some of the projects in the southern Wimmera. And our north-south line was around that sort of Minyip-Dimboola road that runs east-west in terms of the production capacity. What we did was we took an actual financial analysis of 12 years of real data from the Wimmera, and that basically then demonstrated the impact of seasonal volatility. So in that 12 years, we basically ended up with years where there's been drought, years where there was frost, years where there was, super income. And so there's a rate, essentially, to give you an example, at the 70% equity example, there was 1 year of extraordinary profits, 5 years of what we'd consider strong profits, 3 years of just below break even, 1 year of a moderate loss, and 2 years of major losses. And so we think that's fairly representative of the volatility that we've experienced in recent times. We did some modelling around that to get things right, like to allow for the value the value of money changing over time and to allow for things like land prices, interest rates, etc. We used a typical rotational mix for a Wimmera farm and then went from there. So the upshot of the work was that the highest impact was where there was more debt and smaller farm size, which makes a lot of sense. So you can see in each of these scenarios, we looked at the frequency of making a profit in those 12 years. So at 90% equity, 9 out of the 12 years made money, and it was a 50-50 proposition before adding the towers at 70% equity. The addition of towers increased the number of years where you made money, and I think that particularly for the 70% equity. And so I guess that's for that farm size. So I think that's a really important thing to take note of. So profit itself, so the last slide really was looking at risk, and this is looking at the quantity of profit. And the scenarios, like the 7 megawatt scenario at 70% equity, that had the biggest that passive income had the biggest impact on profit, and it increased it by 72% and 83% respectively. At the stronger equity and larger farm sizes, there was 5 towers didn't make a lot of difference to the profit. So again, it really depends on circumstances. We also wanted to look at what does having a consistent stream of passive income do to your ability to leverage finance. And so rather than looking at changes of equity, that was just a little bit too hard to model, we looked at the additional capital value that could be serviced, and essentially, this is over a loan term of 25 years, and it's in the context of the size and equity of Wimmera and Southern Mallee farms. It actually wasn't a lot. So it was 0.835 million for 4 megawatts or 1.49 million for 7 megawatts. Now, it doesn't include that compounding effect of the income generated from those additional borrowings. So it may be an underestimation. And I guess there's 2 key points to this. It's enough to do something with, in terms of, you can build a house for the oldies in town, for example. You can do stuff that you might want to do that you've been putting off, like fix up your house, but it's not going to be the sort of money that's going to allow you to double the size of your farm. So the competitive advantage when you've got a moderate tower number, like only 5 towers, isn't as strong perhaps as it's perceived by neighbours who don't have towers. Mind you, if that income, passive income is 5 times that amount, well then, there would be a considerable competitive advantage. So I just wanted to show a couple of graphs. So this is how the modelling works over time and on the particular seasons. So for example, you've got sort of moderate profits. Then we had a couple of drought years and strong frosts, then a decent year in 16, 17, again some droughty years in 17, 18. 1920 was a really strong year. 2021 was a considerable frost year. 21 was the super profit year, and 22 was the floods year. So anyone prone to flooding, which this particular scenario was, and then 23, 24, pretty handy. So I guess having that adjusted whole farm profit just takes the edge off some of these years, some of these poor years, and brings you back into making money rather than losing money. And the continual nature of doing that then increases the average. And basically with the increased megawatts, it's the same pattern, but just in, you know, a higher magnification. Just wanted to show you the types of numbers we generated so you can, you know, show that we actually calculated this stuff and didn't make it up. So we'll go the first column, if you can just sort of focus on the 1500 to 1500 south 4 megawatt example. So typical of the towers that have been, say, at Marrawara for a while. In this case, the whole farm EBIT average was close to $600,000. The net profit before tax was $2,600, and that's basically the interest rate doing the debt funding doing that. If you look at the 90% equity, it's a much greater net profit. We've calculated things like financial coverage ratio because that's what the banks are interested in, and then brought it down to per hectare so it's relatable. If we then add, in this case, our 5 wind towers, for this farm, it's $83,000 a year. So adjusted EBIT goes up and our whole farm profit goes up. Our financial coverage ratio goes up, and the adjusted EBIT goes up by that amount, and the net profit is increased. So the total increases by 40%. At 70% equity and 7 megawatts, it's a 72% increase. And as I mentioned before, at 90% equity and the lower income from the towers, it's still an increase, but only 18%. So that just gives you a range of an idea of how we calculated these things. And this is the 3,000 hectare version. All of that's in the report, so we'll keep moving. And again, the 3,000 hectare version, in terms of the variation, it's just a lot smaller than what we saw earlier, but it's the same pattern. And that's up in the north, small farm, 7 megawatts, 7% equity. It's significant in the number of years that you're making money versus losing money. And that's the total output. But again, I'll leave you to ponder that in the report. So basically what the case studies told us all up was that every case is different. And we know that from the work we've done in farm business management. Like, you know, when you can't see that because of the way I've got the screen going, but when I wrote the book, that was one of the biggest findings from the literature, that was that, no surprise, but every farm is actually statistically significantly different. So in this scenario, you know, there are some financial advantages there, but they vary in the amount. So it's really important to weigh them up on an individual case. And I guess our overall summary on behalf of Tayla and myself is that energy and ag are very different industries. So there's an opportunity there for both parties to persevere with building understanding to get better outcomes. And the work that Chris's organisation is doing is really important to this. Choosing to host or not to host, it's very situational, and it's a personal decision, but it's complex because it does have community impacts. So it's important to put the work into to actually understand the dollars that you're dealing with or not dealing with, and this sort of data can help, as can your advisors. It's really important to, you know, we've heard stories of companies prospecting and knocking on doors and pressuring people into signing non-disclosure agreements. You have complete agency of your own farm and what happens on your own farm. So it is totally up to you to sign documents or not sign documents. And please don't be pressured into doing things that don't feel comfortable. And please seek advice, and not just legal advice, but if negotiating isn't your thing, or commercial dealings, get some people around you that have expertise in that area. In terms of the opportunities of the projects, the consistency of a passive income stream, it can be really significant. And we've had a pretty handy run in recent years, and so we're probably desensitized to how tight cash flow can be sometimes. But I think it's worth considering the impact that this can have on your farm business. So thanks from ThinkAgri and Pinion, and Chris and Beth, I'll unshare the screen and
all right. If people got any questions, please put them in the chat. And so here's one question without notice, Kate. So you and Tayla, you'll both be thinking on your feet. You mentioned the need to get appropriate support in helping you make decisions. And I was in a discussion yesterday with one of the major projects in the region, where there was a bit of a discussion between some in the farming community and the proponents around how to access appropriate legal and valuation expertise, when often for the farming community, their specialist lawyer is their local solicitor, who they have an excellent relationship with. But what we're talking about in around some of this stuff is commercial law expertise that both the farmer and the local solicitor probably has very little exposure to. How do you find the new trusted advisor in an area that you don't actually know what you don't know, so that you can actually get the trusted advice? And when you're dealing with that trusted advisor, how do you make sure you're getting value for money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Because if you've got no experience in it, I think a lot of the farmers are really struggling to work through that. And I think a lot of the commercial companies are going, oh, we don't know, we can't recommend anyone, otherwise we'll be seen as selling you down the river that you probably don't want to go down. So how do you actually find the right skill sets when you've got no understanding what skill sets you need?
Okay, Chris, so I'll have a go first, and then Tayla, feel free to add on. I guess I'll use an analogy. It's very similar to agronomic and production advice, in that a grower might have a relationship with an agronomist, and it's that agronomist who then has the broader knowledge to be able to go and talk to the research scientists about which varieties to are best suited for the area, and to interpret the latest research on herbicide resistance, etc. So some farmers have a great technical understanding, and they really love lapping up that information from the source, but the majority don't, and so they use somebody as an intermediary. I think there's a space there for intermediaries, and whether they're farm business management consultants or professional negotiators with a background in agriculture and or energy, to help guide, be the signpost to then guide, help communities or individuals work out what exactly they do need, and then guide them towards that. There's some specific law companies, for example, that are specialists in rural commercial law and do a lot of work in mining and energy. And so, but again, you know, and a lot of this comes down to, I guess, word of mouth and taking referrals from people or companies that you trust, and you know, which larger farm business management consulting groups like Pinion, for example, and there's many others like that fit that bill, you know, have good connections with specific commercial operators in commercial law, for example. So I guess that's my way of saying you don't have to solve this all yourself. And so talk to other people that may have more experience in dealing with, you know, specific commercial matters. Tayla, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think as well, just chatting to people that have gone through the process, and particularly that are hosting the wind farms at the moment, just to see how they went about it, even like who they chatted to. Because I know when I was sort of doing the surveys and the interviews, like they were more than happy to just sort of share their experiences and stuff like that. So I think that's really important to sort of chat to people who have gone through it and just sort of get tips and ideas from how they sort of went through the process.
And I guess that's actually brings us to this whole issue of non-disclosure agreements, and people have felt like they can't talk about anything because they've signed an NDA. But the NDA is specific to the commercial arrangements between the two parties. It doesn't stop. It's not a ban on communication about the whole experience. It's just, and it's part of the language of, you know, and I'm someone who's worked on both sides of this, having worked in corporate agriculture, where the default position is that we've got to assume that there's a risk there, and there's no trust between the two parties. So we're going to put all this stuff in place to cover ourselves for those risks. The default position when you're doing business in the bush is that you build a relationship, and then once you've got a relationship, then when you feel comfortable, then you sign something. So we've got these two completely different languages, you know, that's the whole mixed marriage stuff. But there are marriage brokers that can help you deal through all that.
All right, so that excellent. And I think one thing which is probably, I feel, lacking in the correspondence is working out, and you term the words marriage brokers. If we come up with a marriage brokers list on our local energy guidance, probably people will probably get the wrong audience turning up. There'll be people involved in succession plan maybe, but so we probably need to come up with the right list there. But I do think you are highlighting an opportunity of how we can sort of highlight who are not recommended advisors, but a network of people who might play in the space that has some credibility. And it's always a challenge, but I think it's a gap that might need filling. But the other question is, what do you think of the tools in the valuation space, which is equally important besides the legal space, of some of the digital tools like Digital Agricultural Services, who are working heavily with the finance and banking sector and coming up with a lot of valuations, because this is an emerging space, and what often the valuations in the discussions become fundamental and so important for the rest of the discussions. So, yeah, do you think there should be more, the farming community should be more looking at what tools the companies are using, or is the valuations still just everyone's relying on the local valuers and they're their god, or is the digital tools becoming more and more important?
Yeah, okay. Again, I'll have a crack. So there's a couple of issues here. So registered valuers are sworn valuers, have legislation and standards that they have to meet. So if you get a sworn valuation on your property, you know, that's a legally binding document. And you're quite within your rights to engage somebody and do that. I mean, there is an element of subjectivity in how that occurs. And again, you know, with my commercial hat on, often we would get a couple of valuations to get a broader perspective. yes, there are digital tools out there that are being used a lot, but at the end of the day, it's a sworn valuation that is the one that counts, and it's also market value that counts. And there are views. I have a view on how I help people value what I consider commercial land use as opposed to agricultural land use. So, for example, when my brother was negotiating with a bulk handling authority, the bulk handling authority just thought they'd be able to buy it at rural land values, and we sought some advice and got a different view on that, and were able to use that. So I guess the digital tools are useful, and I think it's about asking the companies how they get to their number, and then you using some appropriate advice to get to your number. And, and there'll be a number somewhere in the middle. And these negotiations can take a long time. Like, it took us 2 years to get to the number that we ended up going with in my brother's example. And part of that was, the corporate culture is to stonewall and assume that I'm sitting here in a farm shirt today, and Tayla's sitting there in a nice consulting clothes, and internal subconscious bias can sometimes see somebody sitting here in a crappy shirt like this, assuming that they don't have the commercial wherewithal that somebody sitting in nice, neat clothes has. So it's very easy. Farmers can get underestimated when they're having negotiations on their own place, just simply because they've got out of the paddock and still got their working clothes on. That's purposely why I wore this shirt this morning. And that was the case in our commercial negotiations. There was, and there was a lot of that going on behind the scenes, and it took them a while to realise that we were serious. So yeah, hold your ground. That's the bottom line. Sorry, Chris, we've lost you. You're on mute.
No, I'm unmuted now. So I've had a couple of questions. I know I haven't got any questions in the chat. Does anyone? I'm sure there are some questions. Could just someone indicate in the chat that they're interested in asking one, or in the Q&A feature, just type your name so I can throw to you and allow you to ask the question. And while we're waiting for that, and it'll be really good if someone did put a question in there. Tayla, a question for yourself. When you were doing the interviews, what was the most surprising reflection you heard? Why was it surprising? And what did you, when you sort of reflected on it, what would you think should be the best way to respond to that reflection, either by the person who made the comment or the advice you'd give the person if you had a chance to talk to them afterwards?
I think particularly like around the spraying window, and that was quite so interesting. I sort of think there was particularly, I think, a bit of, I'm not sure how to put it, but I think sort of around the 48 hours for notifying when spraying. I think that was sort of quite interesting, because I know when I sort of chatted to, I think that was sort of one of the reasons that were holding people back from deciding. It was often a major factor in deciding whether to host or not host. And it was quite funny. I sort of brought this up with one of the wind farm companies, and they sort of did mention that quite a lot of the reports are quite sort of, well, the plans and all the contracts and all that are quite sort of individual. So I think one of the main sort of things that they really highlighted was come and chat to us, let us know what you want to know. Like, we're pretty open to negotiating things, which I think is something that often in ag, we're not really used to sort of having those negotiations. I know, sort of, as Kate mentioned before, I think, yeah, they sort of really highlighted that each one's quite individual. So if that's sort of one thing that's putting you off, chat to them. They can't necessarily, like, I mean, it is still a requirement to let them know before spraying and stuff like that. But I think it was sort of more around, let us know if that's what's holding you back. and we can sort of see what we can do. But yeah, I think the main one was really just sort of negotiate and don't sign anything unless you're happy, and make sure that, yeah, you're definitely happy before you sign anything.
Yep. No worries. I'm still looking for questions from the crowd. If there is no further questions, or any final observations, Kate and Tayla, and we'll allow everyone to get back to it.
Yeah, I've got a couple. I guess one way I'd think about when you're seeking information from the energy companies, and to acknowledge too that the energy companies all have their own different cultures and philosophies, and often they're overseas, long-term energy companies and working in Australia for the first time. So there's a matter of working out the fit for you. But I'd liken it to when you think about if you're negotiating the purchase of a really big piece of machinery, you have certain criteria that you're definitely not going to make that $1 million purchase unless those criteria are met and those modifications are met. So if you sort of take that mindset in and then work out a prototype that works for you and then present that prototype, it's just one way of thinking about it.
I have received via SMS text a question, and obviously we might have one of the features wrong here. So I apologise everyone who's been itching to ask questions, because I think we might have disabled something by mistake. I'll take full responsibility there. But Martine has a question, and I'm just going to go to Martine, open up the people and allow Martine to talk. So Martine, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. No worries. My question was, what did host landholders that you spoke to for the case studies say about their experience of trying to sort of, balance community pressures, or that's, social license side of things, and then also the fact that they've got a business to run and take care of?
Yeah, I can answer that one if you like. I think with the social pressures, I think like everyone I sort of spoke to said, they did sort of get a bit of pressure and stuff like that from society, but they sort of just were pretty honest and just sort of when they sort of get that backlash and sort of just say like, look, it was something we had to do to allow mum and dad to move off farm, or like the reasons behind it. That is not just because they saw the income coming in, but it was more like what they can do with that, and it's actually helped. And yeah, I think quite often it wasn't, a lot of people I think a lot that I sort of spoke to were sort of like, look, we wouldn't have the towers just for the sake of it. We don't love the look of them, but it's more the options that it sort of led us to have, whether that's sons coming back home, or it's allowed us to, I don't know, keep farming in a drought year, or when we got frosted and stuff like that. So I think, it was more just sort of explaining the reasons behind it. I think was how, when I sort of chatted to the farmers, was sort of how they dealt with it. And, not everyone's going to like you anyway, either way. So, yeah.
And just to add to that, Martine, it's probably the most difficult issue. The people I've spoken to, in addition to those we surveyed, that's what they're really grappling with, and there is a bit of an impasse in some communities, and I guess people, and again, there's probably intermediaries in there just trying to help people be kind and understanding, and respectful that it is an independent commercial decision. So I think, I don't know whether that's helpful or not to you.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. I just, it's curious, I suppose, in terms of some of these farmers and actually the roles that they also play in their communities, pre even considering these sorts of decisions, and particularly around like farm succession planning, but being able to continue to farm, perhaps, within the family down the line, and possibly a more, likely a more hostile climate, but that ability to keep, I think, the risk of say not being able to continue to farm could mean, you know, selling the farm to a larger, you know, private operation, that then you lose the active kind of civic role that those farmers have always played in their community, I suppose. I was wondering if you kind of had that thought at all.
Yeah, that's always a fear for sure, and I guess, you know, there's been other times of really big change in regions. So one example that comes to mind was when the Wimmera Mallee pipeline was put in, and that was considered really disruptive and quite divisive in some pockets of the community. And yet down one of the questions I've asked when speaking to people about this phase we're in now is, you know, how did you feel then, and how do you feel now about that change? And a lot of the fears they had back then about all the things you're speaking about actually never eventuated. And, you know, and they're quite happy to have the pipeline. So a lot of this is about fear of change, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for everyone for participating. I'm sorry if you wanted to ask a question and didn't get a chance to. If you do want to follow up with a question to either Kate or Tayla, please email Beth or myself. You'll have our contact details and we'll